Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Robert Thomas. Robert is the principal scientist at Scientific Solutions, a consulting company that serves the educational needs of the trace element user community. He has worked in the field of atomic and mass spectroscopy for almost 50 years, including 24 years for a manufacturer of atomic spectroscopic instrumentation. Rob has written over 100 technical publications, including a 15-part tutorial series entitled A Beginner's Guide to ICP-MS. He is also the editor and frequent contributor of the Atomic Perspectives column in Spectroscopy magazine, as well as serving on the editorial advisory board of Analytical Cannabis. In addition, Rob has authored 6 textbooks on the fundamental principles and applications of ICP-MS. His most recent book is entitled A Practical Guide to ICP-MS and Other AS Techniques, which was published in September 2023. Rob has an advanced degree in analytical chemistry from the University of Wales, UK, and is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and a Chartered Chemist. I've attached 5 articles from Robert to the podcast page covering such topics as plastic, stainless steel, and glass contamination in the cannabis industry, as well as the dangers and challenges in measuring heavy metal contaminants in vaping. You can access these by going to www.kisorganics.com and clicking on the Learn tab and then Podcast. Now on to the show. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Tad. Nice to be here.
Yes, so let's start off with a little bit of your background. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into this industry?
Okay, I'm an analytical chemist, and I used to work for an analytical instrumentation company. I worked for them for 25 years. I started off in the UK, and then they transferred me to the US in the late 1980s. And my specialty was in atomic and mass spectroscopy, which is basically an instrumental technique that measures small amounts of trace metals or heavy metals in anything. So that was my background, and I became an application scientist for them, where I traveled all over the world talking about the technique and particularly talking about the benefits of using the instrumentation that I was trained on. The company was called Perkin-Elmer, and they were one of the largest instrument companies in the world at that time. Anyway, I took an early retirement package in the early 2000s. I worked for them for almost 25 years, and not that I wanted to change, but I felt that it was the right time. The retirement package was very attractive, so I decided to leave that company and venture into the world on my own. And I found the world of science writing. I used to write a lot of papers and application reports on the technique that I specialized in, so I had a lot of editorial contacts out there. So I tapped into those, and I found out that there was a demand for me, for someone who spent almost 25 years working in these techniques, but also I spent a lot of time writing. So I found out there was a demand for me as a freelance science writer, which I was a little bit shocked, but I took advantage of it. And my first big project was a tutorial series on ICP-MS. ICP-MS is the most widely used trace element technique in the cannabis industry. And it's a technique that I've been working in for the past 40 years, having actually cut my teeth on the first commercial ICP-MS ever built in 1983. Anyway, they were interested in a tutorial series for beginners, so they called it A Beginner's Guide to ICP-MS. And I got a nice contract where I wrote an article every month, and it turned out to be a 15-part tutorial series. That kind of put me on the map, which was great as a freelance writer. You obviously like credibility and recognition, so that led to a lot of other gigs, a lot of other writing projects, which was wonderful for me. And then I was happy doing that when someone, a colleague of mine said, you know that tutorial series that you wrote, that would make a wonderful book, or it would make the start of a wonderful book. So they put me in touch with a book publisher, and we discussed it, and they said, yeah, we'd be very interested in publishing something like this. So I realized that it probably wasn't enough on its own, so I spent the next 6 months deciding what would be included in my first book. And not only the fundamentals, but I wanted to talk about the applications of the technique. I wanted to talk about what was important for beginners, for novices. So the goal was to write a book which was focused on novice users. So in 2004, I started that. It took me about another 12 months, and the book came out in 2005, and that was called A Practical Guide to ICP-MS. It has since led to 4 editions. The most recent one has just been published in September of this year. So that gave me a lot of opportunities, and it led me to become a lot more, recognized in the field. In the interim period, in between writing different editions for this one book, I was doing a lot of work for the American Chemical Society, and I led the heavy metal task force at the Analytical Reagent Committee for the ACS. So that put me in contact with the pharmaceutical industry, because our specifications and guidelines for reagent chemicals was widely used by pharmaceutical manufacturers. And at that time, United States Pharmacopoeia was going through the process of updating its heavy metal test. The heavy metal test, which was used by United States Pharmacopoeia and the ACS, was a colorimetric precipitation method for doing lead and other heavy metals, and it was very time consuming, and it relied on the color of a precipitate which was developed by adding a sulfide chemical. Unfortunately, it was very user dependent, and it was not very sensitive. So USP was looking for a more sensitive test, and they decided that it would require a test using plasma spectrochemistry, which was my specialty. So in the late 1990s, USP, together with the help of the American Chemical Society, sat down together to write a brand new method for doing heavy metals in pharmaceuticals, and I was intimately involved with that process. And then in 2018, both the ACS and USP came up with a standardized method using ICP optical emission and ICP mass spectroscopy, which was approved by the FDA. So that came out in 2018, and I was involved in that process. And at that time, it was a lot of hard work, because the pharmaceutical industry had never used these techniques before, so they didn't particularly want to change their methodology. But United States Pharmacopoeia and the FDA decided that they could not use a colorimetric test for carrying out a very precise and accurate measurement of heavy metals in pharmaceuticals. Anyway, as I mentioned, that came out in 2018, and that's when a colleague of mine at United States Pharmacopoeia said, you should take a look at the cannabis industry, because they're in a very similar situation, that they don't really understand sources of heavy metals. I was very honored at that time to actually work with United States Pharmacopoeia and write another textbook, which was measuring elemental impurities in pharmaceutical materials. So that came out in 2019. So again, that gave me a lot of visibility to the pharmaceutical community. Anyway, in 2019, that's when I ventured into the cannabis industry, started talking to lots of people, trying to understand where they were coming from, what they were doing, and just learning to talk to cannabis users and to the cannabis industry about what was important to them. And I realized that there was a lot of ignorance, a lot of naivety, and I thought I could really help. And so in 2019, I started the process of beginning to understand what was required. And I quickly realized that there was an opportunity to write another book. And I took that opportunity, and 12 months later, I came out with another book measuring elemental contaminants in cannabis and hemp. And that put me on the road of then writing a lot of educational material for the industry. So, cut a long story short, that led me to getting to understand the demands of the industry and really using my knowledge and expertise to write educational material, give talks, really did as much as I could to really help the industry understand that they probably could be doing better. So that brought me to getting requests to do lots of interviews and podcasts and chair symposiums, and that's where I am today. And I'm sorry for the long-winded response, but my journey has been pretty long, but quite adventurous.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I agree with you. This is an area that we don't have a lot of information as an industry. And I'm really excited to talk to you about lab testing and also cultivation and extraction. But I want to back up just a little bit.
Yep.
So as someone with a chemistry background, why is this so important in the first place? Because these regulations kind of hit the cannabis industry, and like we all understand that lead's bad. Everyone's heard of the Flint water crisis, but why is it so important that we're measuring and regulating these heavy metals in our final product?
Well, I learned very early on that cannabis and hemp are hyperaccumulators. They've been used for decades to clean up contaminated soil and contaminated land. You might be aware that industrial hemp was used to clean up Chernobyl after the nuclear accident in 1986. So as an analytical chemist, I knew that. I knew that certain plants have been used for remediation. I wasn't that familiar with cannabis and hemp, but I soon learned getting into the industry that here's a crop, here's a plant that is used to clean up contaminated soil of heavy metals, radionuclides, isotopes which are have been generated by nuclear fusion and nuclear accidents and nuclear waste. But here's a plant that was also being used to produce cannabinoids, which were being used for medicinal and for recreational purposes. So I thought, hey, this doesn't quite compute here. Surely there must be a process to make sure that hemp and cannabis that's grown for cannabinoid production is not going to be planted in soil or land which could potentially be contaminated with some kind of industrial pollution. Now, I found out early on that a lot of the cannabis, I'm not so much hemp, but cannabis back in the early days was grown indoors, was grown in indoors facilities where the growing environment is far more controlled. Hydroponics were one of the processes that was used, but also to use grow medium where you could control what was in the material, in the product. So back in the early days, heavy metal contamination was not such a huge problem. But then when hemp became legal to grow, people started talking about planting acres and acres of hemp in land and areas of the U.S. where there might be a lot of industrial activity, and in many areas of the western part of the U.S., the nuclear industry, and certainly areas which have been used for mining of gold and silver, where there might be contamination. So there didn't seem to be any diligent way of finding out where there was contamination. And when hemp became legal back 4 or 5 years ago, there didn't seem to be any real interest in finding out was there any industrial contamination in that particular soil. So I felt that here was something which was potentially going to be a huge, huge problem. So, so that's when I started getting involved in it, because it was potentially something where I had a lot of experience in working in those industries to use my techniques to better understand how soil is contaminated and in what way it can be cleaned up. So, that got me really interested in an industry where there was no real there was no real way to find out if hemp was being grown outdoors, whether that particular soil or that particular contaminant land had been contaminated from any previous industrial use.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight for listeners that there's a lot of research out there in terms of, I see primarily around lead and arsenic relating to neurological disorders, birth defects, and other major, fairly catastrophic health effects associated with consumption or exposure to these heavy metals. Is that anything that you want to touch on before I throw out another
Sure, yeah.
question?
I think it's fair to say that that we've known about the potential contamination of all I mean, not only heavy metals, but transition metals, radionuclides, lots of metals from all the industrial processes that have occurred in the US over the past few decades. And certainly having a lot of experience in the environmental field, in the clinical toxicology field, we knew as analytical chemists that were specializing in heavy metal contamination, that there were ways to minimize the uptake of heavy metals, but it was tended to be cost prohibitive, and we know based on food plants that are grown in areas where there might be environmental pollution from a power plant or maybe a steelworks, that there's the potential to absorb heavy metals into any food crops that are grown. Not just root crops, but any kind of vegetable or fruit. If it's in the soil, it will find its way into the plant, into the root, into the fruit, into whatever is planted nearby. So there are ways of minimizing that uptake. Obviously, you got to understand the heavy metals or the contaminated land, but there are ways to minimize the uptake of heavy metals into our food source, but there didn't seem to be a way. The cannabis industry, the cannabis and hemp industry, didn't seem to. I wouldn't say they wouldn't. Okay, they weren't concerned, but they kind of they kind of felt that maybe the process of hemp or cannabis absorbing that heavy metal, if it's planted in sort of clean soil, which is away from any industrial activities, there was a good chance that the uptake wouldn't be that serious. But I think we found with a number of different crops, if they're planted near any industrial sites, there is a good chance there could be a certain amount of heavy metal uptake into that plant, whether it's a root vegetable or whether it's a fruit, or whatever it is. But I think it's fair to say that when the cannabis and hemp industry came along, there didn't seem to be a way of making sure that the land where it was being planted was free of environmental contamination, particularly the heavy metals. So I think it's fair to say that many industries were concerned about heavy metal uptake, but it didn't seem to be serious at that time. But here was an industry that was not really doing any diligent homework about heavy metals that might be resident in the soil where it was being planted.
Yeah, so I have a question that kind of leads into one of the questions I have that I get a lot from growers, and I think it's a fair question. What level of risk do you personally associate with cannabis, being that it's a hyperaccumulator of metals, compared to vegetables, tobacco, our water, um, leaded gasoline from small aircraft, and environmental factors around all the leaded gasoline we used to use back in the 80s and 90s, or just all the other things that we're exposed to on a daily basis? Is it fair that this testing is coming in so tight on cannabis relative to all these other industries and exposure risk?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's fair to say that the cannabis industry exploded. I mean, I came into it 4 years ago, but having talked to people who were in the industry way before me, um, there was not a great deal of thought that went into sort of heavy metal contamination. And historically, um, United States Pharmacopoeia was responsible for, certainly responsible for pharmaceuticals. And, pharmaceuticals are regulated by the FDA, obviously. And it took a long time for the pharmaceutical industry to come up with any meaningful regulations. And I think it's fair to say that when the FDA got involved with regulating pharmaceuticals, particularly for heavy metals, I don't think they were aware that they didn't really consider that heavy metals was a potential problem. But I think as the pharmaceutical industry realized that there are many pharmaceuticals which are derived from products which are grown, which are planted, particularly nutraceuticals and dietary supplements. And I think they then took a vested interest in understanding heavy metals. And United States Pharmacopoeia, when they first came out with methods for pharmaceuticals, came up with a method for 24 elemental impurities. And initially, when they were just monitoring a small group of heavy metals, basically lead was the only heavy metal they were interested in. But I think they soon realized that when you're producing pharmaceuticals, particularly pharmaceuticals which might be made from products that are grown, um, there is the likelihood of finding a whole slew of heavy metals in them. So that's why it took them about 25 years to go from basically monitoring one heavy metal, lead, to eventually monitoring 24. And so I think the cannabis industry had a model that they could follow. Unfortunately, they did not follow that model. They decided that um, the four most toxic heavy metals, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, were the ones which are of most concern. So they started with those. Um, and then when the states started getting, when states started to regulate them, state regulators felt that four heavy metals was enough because lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury were considered the most toxic. Um, but with regard to pharmaceuticals, they realized that it was not enough just to monitor lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. That's why they eventually ended up with a list of 24. Unfortunately, the cannabis industry have not progressed from that, and state regulators felt that as long as they monitored those big four, they felt that was enough. Some states decided to expand that list, but even the most diligent states, for example, New York State only monitors eight heavy metals. So state regulators, state cannabis regulators, have not felt that it was necessary to expand that list. But clearly, the pharmaceutical industry has set a standard of 24 elemental impurities, and that is the standard United States Pharmacopoeia test for all pharmaceuticals. But as we know, there are many cannabis products that are used for pharmaceutical grade products. So I think it's only a matter of time before they eventually end up monitoring more than the big four. Some states are proactive, like New York, and is monitoring 8. But I think it's only a matter of time, and there's enough evidence in the public domain to suggest that if you start looking at, if you start monitoring a whole bunch of the other heavy metals up to 24, you'll find them.
Yeah, I get the sense, and I understand from a chemist perspective that you're pro testing, which makes sense. And I would say that I am too in a lot of ways, but I also realize, like, as a grower or from a cultivator perspective, it's really, really challenging because one, it's expensive. It puts the onus on the grower to do this testing. And when we have to do this testing, it raises our costs, which I think pushes people to the black market in a lot of ways too. So I think there's a risk associated there that I hope regulators look at. But the other thing I've been thinking about lately too is, like, when I go to the store and I, being health conscious, try to buy organic foods where I can. If I buy the organic onions out of Mexico, for example, what assurance do I have that those weren't grown near an aluminum smelter or a mine of some sort, where I may be exposing myself to a much higher health risk than if I bought onions that were grown in, say, California using conventional fertilizers and pesticides? That's where I feel like this testing onus is not being fairly expressed across all of our potential risks to our society. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, the only way I can answer that is that I've been in this field for almost 50 years, trace element and heavy metal analysis. And you see industries go through a logical phase in trying to understand where heavy metals play a role in that industry. And you'll find that industries or application areas that decided to be proactive with regard to looking at heavy metals. Obviously, the EPA is a big incentive, for drinking water companies, for companies that are involved in the environmental business. But I think with the case of large industries out there, there's a feeling that heavy metals have been around for a long time, and we are an industrial society, and we've managed to be an industrial economy for a long time. But I think the point that I'd like to make is, if we are aware of a potential hazard, I think we should do our utmost to make sure, if there are large consumers of that product where heavy metal contamination could be an issue, I think we have a vested interest to fully understand how we can reduce the exposure of consumers that might be exposed to high levels of heavy metals. And being an analytical chemist, which is specialized in this area for the past 50 years, I see different industries going through different cycles and different phases. And I just feel that the cannabis industry at the moment is going through a phase where I think it understands that there is a potential problem, but at this present moment in time, they're only being required to monitor the big four, and in some cases, in some states, a few more. But clearly, heavy metal environmental pollution is a serious concern. I mean, the EPA have been doing soil analysis for decades, and they're finding that near industrial sites, there's a lot of industrial pollution, and certainly if any crops are being grown anywhere near the industrial, the industrial site, um, the EPA, for example, will make sure that those industries are being diligent in making sure um, that they're monitoring these industrial sites for these heavy metals or whatever metals are required. I feel that the cannabis industry at this present moment in time, they're they're going through the process of trying to clean up their industry, but clearly you can see that based on environmental pollution, which we know is out there, but certainly if you're not looking for a wider panel of environmental pollutants, you're not going to find them. But I think it's fair to say that in many of the studies that have been carried out up to now, that they're finding environmental pollutants which go beyond the big four. And we know, for example, that the National Institute of Standards and Technology are coming out with reference materials for cannabis and hemp, which is finding 13, 14, 15 metals which are not being monitored. The big four being monitored, but they're finding there's industrial hemp out there which is absorbing a lot more than the big four. And for example, they're finding elements like uranium in them, and that's because they're being planted in soil which is contaminated. We know that ASTM have come up with a standardized method for doing heavy metals in cannabis material, and they just come out with a method, and they found out that there were up to 24 elemental impurities in the in the standard method because the cannabis and hemp that they use to develop the method contain quite high levels of other heavy metals which are not being monitored. So we know they're getting into the product, but I think we're at a stage with regard to standardization and making sure that we're coming up with a standardized method that we're not at a point yet where we're beginning to look for a wider slew of heavy metals. I think it's only a matter of time before, once we start carrying out a wider panel, it's only a matter of time before we're going to find them.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think we are going to see more and more testing, and I think as we see more testing, we'll find more things. And it's hard to make an argument against testing for heavy metals from a regulatory perspective. People want to know that things are safe. I just think it's crazy that we can have heavy metals in our baby food. I live on an island with about 8,000 homes. That's about 15 miles from a Superfund site. And I have 10 to 20 ppm of arsenic in my soil. I know that. And as a grower, I won't grow vegetables or fruit trees on my property, but I see them on all my properties and other people around me, and people are eating it. And it's just, I think it's unfortunate that I feel like, and nicotine would be another great example of this. We don't have this level of testing with nicotine, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. And I think it's here. So let's dive into some of the nitty gritty of it then.
Sure.
I want to, so I kind of broke this up into three sections: the vaping and consumption, lab testing, and cultivation and extraction. I kind of want to go straight to lab testing because you were talking about the amount of testing that's happening. And I know this is really your strongest area of expertise. So as a grower, when I send in my samples, how confident can I be in that lab testing and that result? So if it comes back and says it has this much ppms of arsenic and this much cadmium, how accurate is that number truly? Like, what's the standard deviation that we're talking about with such a small number for pass and fail?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a really good question because the cannabis industry is new, and I think it's fair to say that some of the labs that are out there are not of the highest caliber, and that's not meant to be overcritical, but it's an industry that's grown, rapidly in the past 5 to 10 years, and testing labs are springing up all the time, and I think there's something like 750 testing labs in the whole of the US. Well, you divide that by the number of states where cannabis is legal, which I think is about 40 approximately. So there's a whole bunch of testing labs in every state where cannabis is legal. Is the quality consistent? Absolutely not. I mean, I think some of them are well run and they have a high level of expertise, but you got to understand that these testing labs have sprung up so quickly and they've hired people who don't necessarily have the desired expertise to run a technique like ICP-MS spectrometry, which often requires a decade of experience to fully understand how to get the best out of it. It's a complicated technique, and it's a technique that can give you bad data if you're not using it correctly. And I'm not being overcritical here, but I think many of these testing labs have sprung up so quickly, and they've ended up in warehouses in places which are not ideally suited to put a lab. So the contamination issues are there. Maybe the expertise of the operator is not there. That sometimes they don't hire the best people. So all of a sudden you find that there's people running these instruments in warehouses. They don't have a lot of experience in using an ultra trace element technique that can get down to part per quadrillion. But if they're being run in a warehouse, it's almost meaningless. So you can argue that the 750 or so lab testing facilities in the US, I'm not saying that they're all generating bad data, but you got to understand that ICP-MS is a very specialized technique.
So knowing that there is the potential for lab error or issues with various labs, this is such a costly fail for a grower. Sometimes it can be the difference between bankruptcy or staying in business, because we're talking thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars if you get a failure. What can we do on the grower side to better ensure that we pass a test? I'm not talking, I don't want to get into cultivation side yet, but I mean, like, should we be washing our samples? Should we be sending it to more than one lab prior to going in for that final test? Is dust something that's really a relative concern with when we're talking about such small amounts, and such precise testing?
Well, I think we have to be realistic that these labs are being put together very quickly. And ICP-MS is an ultra sensitive technique, and some of the contamination issues are not being addressed. So I think with the best intent in the world that you can hire someone who's reasonably competent, but because you put in the instrument in basically a warehouse, and they're not going into specialized rooms, you got to be aware that contamination is a huge problem for a technique that's capable of measuring down to parts per quadrillion. So it's not that the people who run in them, I mean, sometimes they're inexperienced, but the fact is that ICP-MS is typically placed in a clean room, is typically placed in a specialized room where there can be no contamination. They have to have a positive pressure, so in other words, nothing can be blown in from outside. Normally, the sample preparation area is separate from the instrumental, from the instrument, because you're worried about, contamination when you're digesting these samples, which contain high concentrations of mineral acids. So you got to make sure that there's minimum contamination. And I think what's happened is that these cannabis testing labs have grown so rapidly over a short period of time, is that they're doing the best job they can do. But you got to understand, this is a technique that was developed back in the early 80s to measure down to parts per quadrillion level. Now, it's very difficult to explain what that means, but this is a technique that was developed to measure ultra low levels. And the levels that are being requested by the cannabis industry are not that particularly low. The technique is probably capable of measuring 1,000 times lower, but because they are being housed in non-specialized equipment, you're obviously not going to get the best out of the technique. That together with maybe they're not hiring the best people who don't really understand the capability of the technique, so you can get all kinds of contamination problems. When you combine that together, I think it's fair to say that maybe the data that's been generated, I mean, not by all testing labs, but many testing labs are not considering the technique they're using, and they're not considering where the technique is being housed. And I think that's detrimental to get the best data and the highest accuracy.
So for those of us that are not familiar with ICP, I've never been in a lab, for example. What are some potential sources of contamination that I may not have considered? You mentioned being housed in a warehouse, but let's say someone does have a clean room. What could, for example, I don't know, the clothing that someone was wearing, or potentially other things, could a prior sample potentially contaminate the next sample? What are some of the things that people should be looking for?
Yeah, I've actually published quite widely on this. Yeah, there are things that people do if they're not used to working in the ultra trace environment. They just do things where it's pretty easy to contaminate the sample. Just by digesting and dissolving the sample, for example. These are typically done in microwave digestion systems. Well, if you're not diligent about keeping your microwave digestion equipment clean, or using ultra clean acids, ultra clean chemicals, making sure that it's done in an area which is away from any maybe sample preparation, maybe an area where they're bringing the sample in, bringing the cannabis sample in, bringing the flower in, or bringing the plant in. That has to be kept away from where the sample is digested. Obviously, you have to have it has to be done in a positive pressure, so it has to be done within a fume hood, which is if there's any environmental contamination, you have to have a positive pressure under the hood, so you're actually taking away any contaminants. Obviously, when you're using something like a very sensitive technique, many industries you have to use specialized equipment. You have to use specialized acids, which are very clean acids, or you might have to dress up in what are called bunny suits. So you, the analyst, is not actually contaminating the sample. That's quite common in the semiconductor industry. But also, when you're preparing the sample, when you're diluting the sample, you got to make sure that your acids are clean. You got to make sure that you're using the cleanest ultra pure, deionized water. And then you have to make sure that the instrument itself, you have positive extraction over the instrument, and there's nothing that can actually drop down into where the sample is going. And there are many examples where industries which are used to working in an ultra clean environment take multiple steps to make sure that there's no contamination taking place in the sample. I think in general, the cannabis testing labs do a reasonable job at that, but I think many of them don't. And I think, the data you're generating is only as good as your sample preparation area. And having seen a number of the sample preparation areas of some of the cannabis testing labs, it leaves a lot to be desired because they're just not used to working in the ultratrace environment. And the cannabis industry and cannabis labs have been set up often in warehouses or in labs which are not considered ultra clean.
So once a lab gets signed off on by regulators, is anyone auditing these labs on a consistent basis?
The state, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a state responsibility, and within the cannabis within the state sort of cannabis testing labs, there are people who have expertise in that area, but I'm not too sure they're being super diligent. I think it's fair to say that these cannabis testing labs have sprung up very, very quickly, and they fall under the responsibility of the the state cannabis testing folks, which there can be a lot of expertise within that state lab, or there might not be. And I think it's fair to say that it's not like it's a semiconductor lab, which the semiconductor industry is used to working in the ultratrace environment, so they know how to set up an ultratrace testing lab. I think probably cannabis. State cannabis labs have not really had to do that, and I think some of them might be lacking. I'm not saying they're all lacking, but I think it's fair to say that that some of the state labs have have other priorities, and they might not be so diligent in making sure that the labs are doing a really good job. It's difficult to know.
That's why I guess this is one of the other reasons I have a big issue with adding more testing is until they have the regulatory side figured out and consistent to where the burden of proof and the impact is so catastrophic on growers for a failed test. Until we can have any confidence in these tests, it just doesn't seem right to roll out more tests. But I do want to move on just because I have a bunch of questions for you.
Yeah.
So since we can't do anything about the testing, we can't really do a lot about the regulations in the short term. This is the environment that we're stuck with. What can we do as a grower to better improve our chances of passing a test? So I think I mentioned before, like, should we be washing our samples with something like deionized or RO water to remove any dust or particles that may have landed on the bud? Is that something that you would recommend? What are your thoughts on that before I ask other questions?
Well, yeah, I think, I'm not too sure whether that's, that's kind of cost effective. I think it's fair to say that, the cannabis industry has got to the point where it's grown very, very rapidly over a short period of time, and I think growers do a reasonable job of making sure that their product is being tested, but I'm not too sure whether it's kind of cost effective to go on.
Sorry, I'm just talking about, like, if I'm going to send in a sample to a lab for a 5-pound lot, for example, to be able to pass, should I be cleaning that small sample? So to phrase this another way, like, for example, because of where I live, let's say I walk outside and I'm carrying my sample, and some of the dust that I know is 10 to 20 ppm of arsenic may have been kicked into my facility or may have been kicked up on my way to my truck. how would that impact my sample passing or failing? Is that little bit of dust a real risk when we're talking about such a precise instrumentation? That's really what I'm getting. So like, should I be cleaning just my small sample, not my entire crop?
Um, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, certainly, um, if you're talking about taking a small weight of the sample, typically half a gram is taken for analysis. Is that half a gram representative of what's being sampled? I mean, I don't know. I think it's unlikely that washing is going to impact that half a gram of sample that's actually taken for analysis. Um, and you know, I think it's fair to say that you know, I think growers do a reasonable job of getting the sample in a convenient form, for testing. Um, but I think the question I have is monitoring just for heavy metals, representative of what's in the sample? And I think based on the number of different growing conditions throughout the US, I think it's fairly well understood that based on what we know from environmental pollution from a multitude of crops that are grown, for commercial purposes, whether it's for, vegetables or whether it's for, you know, any type of, eh, I mean, anything. I think it's fair to say that there's so much environmental contamination out there that clearly that there's a lot more than just the big four heavy metals which could be potentially contaminating any vegetable crop out there. So um, I think it's fair to say that many of the industries which have grown up through from the food processing industry um, have you know have taken a I think have taken a wider look at the other potential elements, heavy metals, which could be contaminating their crops. So, I'm not too sure that answers your question, but I think potentially um, that we're probably, not monitoring enough heavy metals.
So what are potential sources of contamination that should be looked at in a typical indoor facility? Um, can we maybe talk about that a little bit?
In a Okay, in an indoor facility.
Yes.
Okay. Well, obviously, there's less environmental contamination for something that's grown indoors. I mean, clearly, but it depends what you're growing it in. Are you growing it in soil? Are you growing it? Is it being grown hydroponically? Um, what source of 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 water are you using?
Yeah. So I understand that like your media, whether it's you know, peat moss, rock wool, cocoa core, water, whatever that media is a primary source of heavy metals, and that makes a lot of sense. So I think as a grower, the first thing I'm going to look at is what is my media and what are the nutrient sources that I'm using to feed this plant.
Yes.
Beyond that, I think water is a big source of contamination, and this is a separate question, but let's just dive into it. You mentioned in your white paper that the EPA estimated 30 million people live in areas where drinking water violated safety standards,
Yep.
which is crazy to me because I think there's a lot of other risks out here beyond cannabis that people are being exposed to on a daily basis that our government's not regulating. But um, what I think about when I hear that, and something I've been learning with growers is, let's just say that your water passes for arsenic, for example, and it's got a tiny amount, or maybe that amount is so small it's not being picked up by the water testing facility because they're only testing to a certain level of
Yep.
concentration.
Yep.
Um, but if I drink a gallon of that water a day, I'm totally fine. But if I'm putting 40,000 gallons through a room that's got a cannabis plant in it, the amount of heavy metal, if we look at it from sort of a mass flow perspective, that's going to be building up in that soil, in that media, that's going to be taken up by the plant over the course of that growth cycle is actually probably my biggest source of contamination, versus just, adding a little bit of bat guano or a little bit of soft rock phosphate. Even if that soft rock phosphate is much higher, say it's 20 ppm of arsenic, but I'm using a relatively small amount compared to the amount of water that's going through my room. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I think we know based on plants that are using a very clean source of water, and I think it's fair to say that EPA has done a good job of regulating our water supply, but I think it's fair to say that that many water authorities don't test their water on a regular basis. So it might be 2 years before they have to submit data to the EPA that their local water supply is below the EPA guidelines. But the question is that in that 2-year period, are there any of those heavy metals which are falling outside those EPA limits? Because there's no requirement to test it sort of more regularly than every couple of years. So I'm not too sure that answers your question, but certainly I think that most sources of drinking water in the US, because they are regulated by the EPA, are probably clean enough. But as we saw, in Flint back in a few years ago, is that people were negligent and they ended up using water which was contaminated with a whole bunch of heavy metals. Now, I don't think that happens on a regular basis, but negligence can create a scenario like that.
So I guess if I wanted to distill my question even further, though, I guess what I'm asking is, even water that may meet EPA standards for drinking, for human consumption, may not meet what standards we should have for cultivation, because of the massive amount of water that's going to go through a crop during a given growth cycle.
I don't know if I can answer that question. I mean, it depends what those volumes are. I think it's fairly. I think potentially that could be the case, but I think it depends on what volumes are used.
Sure.
But I think it's fair to say, because there's been a lot of work done on looking at potential contamination sources in water that's used to cultivate things like cannabis that's grown for making FDA approved drugs, something like Epidiolex, which we know is grown indoors, and it's produced in indoor facilities. And when GW Pharmaceuticals, who were the original manufacturer of Epidiolex, were going through FDA approval, I mean, they had to show a lot of data about their process of growing, cannabis indoors, because it's grown indoors. But certainly they had to obviously, when they were going through that process, they were impacted by United States Pharmacopoeia at that time, who were monitoring up to 24 elemental impurities, and they had to make sure that their growing process was ultra clean, and they were checking their manufacturing process at multiple points to making sure that there were no heavy metals present. And here's an example of a product which was grown, specifically for producing a CBD pharmaceutical, which was aimed for childhood epilepsy. And they just had to make sure that their manufacturing process was ultra clean. But the question is there a requirement for companies that are manufacturing or are producing cannabis indoors or hemp indoors? Are they dictated by something, or do they have to go through the whole process that a pharmaceutical manufacturer like GW Pharmaceuticals had to go through to produce a CBD-based drug called Epidiolex? I don't know.
So knowing that water is a potential source of contamination, that would push me towards reverse osmosis water. However, as you probably know, RO water is very wasteful to produce. It's very expensive and costly. And what are the risks of using RO water? Truly, fairly pure water. How does that raise the risk associated with its contact with different media, with metal or other things on its way to the plant? Plastics, glass, things like that.
I know that deionized water that's utilized for laboratory use is really expensive to produce. I'm not too sure it would be cost effective to use something like deionized or demineralized water, for cannabis plants. I mean, I think I can't answer that question because I don't know, but certainly deionized or demineralized water that's used for laboratory use is extremely expensive, and I'm not too sure it would be cost effective to use that
that's a whole nother level of purity. But RO water tends to be very low ppm of impurities by the time it goes through the filtration process, and the issue with that, and this is where the chemistry gets a little bit beyond my knowledge, but I know that water wants to be bonded with something.
Yeah.
And so that being the case, when it comes into contact with metals, some other and other materials, it can potentially pull or chelate with these heavy metals at a higher rate than water that's mineralized. So we tend to want to buffer water and pH it prior to watering our crop, which creates a lot of other challenges. But that was sort of what I was getting at, is like, what are the risks associated with using RO water in terms of its flow into the media through our plumbing, through, let's say I put it into a big plastic vat, and then I use a sump pump that has metal parts inside to pump it out. What are the higher risks associated maybe with corrosion or pulling heavy metals out of that pump that may have been made, in China and contain various levels of heavy metals that weren't regulated with the production of a sump pump, for example? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. Well, I think if your water was the only thing you had to be concerned about, I think I tend to agree with you. But I think you got to look at the entire growing process. I mean, what else is involved besides watering the plant? What kind of nutrients are you using? What kind of fertilizer are you using? What else is the plant being exposed to? And I think maybe I don't know what kind of fertilizers you use. I mean, but I think it's fair to say that fertilizers can be a source of heavy metal contamination. Certainly, is there any kind of additional environments that your plant is being exposed to in the growing process, which you're not fully aware that there might be some kind of contamination around. Um, I think I think it's fair to say, based on an historical perspective, that plants that are grown indoors are in theory are going to contain less potential heavy metal contamination than plants that are grown outdoors. But there's still the opportunity to expose your plants to some kind of heavy metal contamination. It's sort of. I think I remember a few years ago that one manufacturer or one grower was using some kind of bud enhancer which contained nickel, and they asked me, was there some is there the potential for the nickel in that bud enhancer to find its way into the plant? And I said, yeah, there is. Someone was using, and I can't remember who it was, so don't quote me. Someone was using a soluble silicate material to increase the strength of their shoots. And they asked me, is it possible that and I said, yeah, if you're using any external sources of any metal, heavy metal, transition metal, anything in the growing process, potentially it could end up in the plant. And if it's in the plant, potentially it can end up in the products that you're manufacturing from that plant.
So is silicon a big health risk, though? Because it has a lot of different plant benefits. It could be argued to even be an essential mineral in a lot of cases.
I think, yeah. Well, it depends what level, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's but there are environmental controls of these elements, and even though silicon is an element that you find everywhere. In glass, for example, it's very difficult to eliminate silicon from any material that's exposed to glass. But this grower was adding higher concentrations of silicates, and I can't even remember in what form it was. But yeah, I think if you
typically it's potassium silicate is the most common form.
Okay, all right, yeah. So I think if you start exposing your plant to percent levels of silicates, I think there's a good chance you could have higher than normal levels, and ending up in your product.
Oh, we do tissue testing and see higher levels.
Right.
And higher levels of silicon is associated with reduced or higher pest resistance, thicker stalks. It actually mitigates trace minerals. It helps toxicities by better spreading those minerals throughout the biomass of the leaf. I guess I haven't heard of a lot of things associated with the risks associated with silicon, because it is so ubiquitous in our environment and our crops in general.
I think you're right, but it's got to get to the point where obviously if you start finding really high levels of silicon in a product, I think there could be questions then. That's all. I mean, it's not as if it's. I think historically, silicon has been so ubiquitous, in the environment, that if you look at the regulated levels in anything, I mean, silicon levels are reasonably high, so it's very difficult to not have any silicon in any kind of water. But nickel, for example, nickel was used as a bud enhancer, and I mean, nickel is a carcinogen at high levels, so you don't want high levels of nickel in your product.
Sure. Nickel, I could totally understand. And maybe this next question isn't something that is your area of expertise, but are there best practices as a grower we can observe to reduce heavy metal uptake? Maintaining a higher media pH, taking samples from newer plant tissue, removing more stem material. What are some of the things we can do as a grower from a cultivation
Well,
perspective?
yeah, I think it's fair to say that, I mean, depending on whether you're growing indoors or outdoors, certainly plants that are grown outdoors, potentially there's going to be higher levels of, what I call heavy metals, but elemental contaminants, because heavy metals, there's no real definition to heavy metals because it could be one group to one, it could be group metals to one person and a different group, to another person. But I think it's fair to say that there are ways to minimize heavy metal uptake. Obviously, um, if you're working with a higher soil pH, there's a good chance that you're going to be extracting certain heavy metals based on a lower pH. And I think it's fair to say that there are ways to minimize the uptake of heavy metals. I mean, we know that soils that you're naturally high in heavy metals. You want to try and minimize based on the pH of the soil, but you also want to make sure that that the soil chemistry is, I mean, not just heavy metals, but you're talking about the, phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen content. You're talking about maybe, the organic content. I think some soils are better than others, but I think you can minimize the uptake of heavy metals, by by making sure your soil chemistry is optimum. But at the end of the day, I don't think you're going to, stop the extraction of heavy metals from the soil when you're growing anything, particularly outdoors. So
Sure.
I mean, I just think that you have to be realistic. I mean, particularly nowadays where most of the growing of hemp in particular is outdoors. So there's only so much you can do to a soil. You can try and increase the pH slightly by maybe adding lime to your soil, because the more acidic the soil is, the more chance you're going to uptake heavy metals. But there are materials to add to reduce heavy metal uptake. Things like organic biochars, which are basically changing the soil chemistry and stopping the formation of ions in solution. So I mean, there are historically there are ways to minimize the uptake of heavy metals, for any plant material. But my question is the cannabis industry really looking at those approaches because they may be increasing the cost of production? We know that there's a lot of work done in the area of biochars from natural products, from say nuts and biomass, which is used to till into the soil, which really is a way of capturing the heavy metals and stops its bioavailability for the plant. So there are ways of doing that, but is it cost effective? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that I've been researching pretty heavily the last couple of years, and as someone who works with a lot of different cultivators in various states that have a variety of regulations, yeah, there are things we're doing like running a higher media pH in our soils and utilizing a very clean source of biochar, so we're not adding more heavy metals from the way the biochar is produced. Testing all of our inputs. So it's impossible to have a perfectly clean organic soil and nutrient program because these, heavy metals are sort of ubiquitous in any mine product or any soil or any ocean based product. But
Yeah.
I think we are working to reduce those. And then it really comes down to management, between our water, and our media and our nutrients, can we keep that level at a passing threshold where the plant is going to take it up, but take it up at a level that's lower than what we're bringing in every cycle to renew our fertility? So it is something that I think we're actively looking to manage, but it's a struggle because we're not getting a lot of great information back from the labs or from regulators as we try to navigate all of this.
Yeah, and I feel like I think that's where I'm critical of the industry, is that it needs, and this is, if you like, my beef. I feel the industry as a whole is not looking at this problem and trying to resolve it as an industry. There are individual parts of the industry that are trying to do their bit, but as an industry, they're not coming together because, clearly, we know that hemp and cannabis are very strong hyperaccumulators. If it's in the soil, hemp or cannabis will find it and suck it up. That's the type of plant it is. And how do you minimize that? And if it's in there, can you stop it getting into your initial product, which are basically an extract which is going to be used for further use some way down the line to produce a commercial product. But the whole process of going from growing cannabis and hemp to a consumer that's using something, there's a lot of areas in between where the industry could be doing more. In my opinion, having come from industries which have been highly regulated and knowing how they've approached, contamination of heavy metals from a wide array of sources, is that the industry is not working together. It seems to be working, individual parts seem to be working in isolation from the others. And I think it could be doing a lot more to making sure that there are safer products out there. Now, I'm not being critical, but in the 4 years that I've been in the industry, I've looked at individual areas, individual components, and everyone is doing their little bit, but the industry's not getting together as a whole and deciding how they're going to approach this for the benefit of the user.
Okay, well, last question I have for you, because my friend and coworker Brandon Hudson went to that conference that you were recently a part of, talking about heavy metals more from a laboratory regulatory perspective.
Yep.
But after attending, he said, "I'm never going to vape again." So let's talk about vaping. And you've published articles on these. I will link to those articles. In 5 minutes, can you tell me why it's so dangerous compared to other methods of consumption, and why you would say it's probably a good idea to not vape?
Well, I'm fighting an industry here which is very difficult to really get them to fully understand what the issues are. Look, I've never smoked in my life. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. You can believe that, but I haven't. So I can.
Me either, actually. I've never had a cigarette. So
I could look at an industry which is where vaping has become, I don't know the percentage, but I would say probably close to 50% of the consumption of cannabinoids is done by some kind of vaping device. I don't know, but that's my guess. And for an industry that's developed these vaping systems with no real forethought on how the liquid or the product inside the device is getting consumed. So in other words, we have a liquid. It's diluted with something, maybe a vitamin E acetate, maybe actually it isn't anymore, but maybe with propylene glycol, or maybe MCA oil. But the number of opportunities for that solution to extract metals from the vaping device is numerous, whether it's left in the device and is left to corrode the internal devices, the internal, metallic components. And it's been shown that even when a device has not been used, it's been on a retailer's shelf for 3 months, it's extracted metals from the coil, from the tank. So if you start there, that even before the device has been vaped, there are metal impurities in the extract, in the liquid inside it, and then all of a sudden you ramp it up to sometimes 400 degrees Celsius. So you're taking those metal particles which have been maybe corroded from inside the device, and now you're beginning to elevate the temperature to 400 or 500 degrees Celsius, together with the cannabinoid, and someone is inhaling that, and it's going into their airways, going into their lungs. They're getting some satisfaction from the cannabinoid, but where are those metal particles going? They're probably going somewhere, they're being coated somewhere in the person who's vaping airways. And there's very little done to make sure that those vaping devices are not being contaminated with metal components that they're made from. So, my beef is that why isn't there any effort being made to produce a much cleaner device? I can understand that cost is probably the problem, but there are metals out there which are far less corrosive than things like stainless steel, nichrome, niconel, Cantal, which many of these devices have in them, and they're notorious for, in a corrosive atmosphere, they're notorious for actually dissolving into the liquid, into the solution. And where does it go? It goes into the lungs of the person who's vaping. And I think the industry has to do a much better job of making sure that the devices themselves are cleaner. There's so much out there that I see which has not been published, because this is something, if you like, I've kind of taken upon myself to get a better understand, because I worked for PerkinElmer for 25 years, and we sold a lot of our equipment to the CDC, who were responsible for characterizing nicotine vaping devices. And although they published a little bit on their work, they have not really been allowed to look at cannabinoid vaping devices. And my contact at the CDC says that who knows what's going on with corrosion of metal components with these vaping devices, because they can be a lot more corrosive than nicotine solutions. So it's an area which I think is probably going to there's going to be a lot more research done on it. But I believe it's a ticking time bomb. We've seen the vitamin E acetate crisis of 2019 rear its ugly head with 300 cases of hospitalization and 70 deaths. I don't like to appear to be like a doomsday here, but I think potentially there's another vitamin E acetate crisis waiting to happen with vaping devices. They're just so widely used, and there's very little being done to really put a check on them.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that, and hopefully that raises some awareness for people, and they can make better health decisions or do their own research if they're going to continue that practice. So.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the industry is moving very, very rapidly, and I think because of the industry is moving so rapidly, regulations often struggle to keep up with it. Now, you can argue that the FDA will probably be involved at some point, although there's no real sign that they really want to at the moment. But state regulators have a vested interest in seeing revenue in their particular site, so I don't particularly blame them, but I think the industry needs to take a hard look at itself, because I think there's stuff going on which under a federally regulated system, you might not see.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing all that, and thank you for your time today and answering all my questions.
Okay. I'm glad I could help.
That was Robert Thomas, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review and give us a follow on Instagram. We also have a Patreon where you can get insider access to the team at Kiss Organics through Hangouts, as well as earn some cool perks and benefits for supporting the podcast. Lastly, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website homepage to stay up to date on the latest research and information. Thanks for listening.